Commodore Bhaskar, the Defence Minister was very categorical about Ukraine and the Russia crisis. He made two important points on the subject of Russia and Ukraine, in which he first said that India has expressed concern at the situation of Ukraine, and second he said Russia and Ukraine need to sit down and talk and resolve the crisis. How do you see these two lines in the speech of the Defence Minister at the SCO meeting yesterday?
Mr. Rajnath Singh's observations at the SCO meeting are indeed politically very significant, both in terms of the current global response to the war in Ukraine, which, as we are aware, has completed 6 months, and we have actually entered the 7th month of that war. So far, I think there has been a certain amount of internal review in India about this war and what kind of a response India should make in the public domain. And I would say that there was a certain amount of circumspection, and India did not join the US-led criticism against Moscow at that time. But concurrently, India was both reviewing and conveying its own concerns to Moscow bilaterally. And I think this articulation in a collective forum such as the SCO, which brings together Russia, China, India, along with the stans, as also Pakistan, is, to my mind, politically and diplomatically significant articulation by India. And in a way, if I may add, it also, I think, burnishes India's own credibility as a voice of a certain degree of restraint and reason at a time when there is a certain shortage of objective and calm reflection on these matters, because the whole Ukraine war has got polarized into a binary between Russia on one side and the US-led alliance on the other.
Commodore Bhaskar, you mentioned humanitarian crisis. The Defence Minister also mentioned at the SU meeting yesterday. He said, I quote, India is concerned about the humanitarian crisis. Sir, in and around Ukraine, could you please explain this to our listeners? What would in and around Ukraine mean?
I would say that this is, I think, a very subtle reference to the fact that what is happening in Ukraine, the war itself, is having a ripple effect in the extended region. Now, we are aware that immediately for those countries that are proximate to Ukraine, there is a major refugee issue of people who have fled Ukraine and are seeking safety. Many of the smaller countries are unable to cope, and there is a food and fuel crisis that is currently looming large. And not only in Europe, but outside of Europe, we can see that those countries that were dependent on timely food supplies, fertilizer supplies emanating from Ukraine are now having to deal with shortages. That in turn leads to a humanitarian crisis, which in a non-linear way is being felt in many of the vulnerable nations, the developing nations of the world, well outside of the European theatre. Now, I do not want to overinterpret what Mr. Rajnath Singh has said, but I think he was also alerting the SCO as a community to draw their attention to the fact that apart from Ukraine, there are other regions in our own Southern Asian context, which is the primary footprint of focus for the SCO.
We will move on to Afghanistan. The Defence Minister of India, Rajnath Singh, laid a lot of stress on the situation in Afghanistan. He voiced that India is full support to peaceful, secure and stable Afghanistan, and he also stressed that the respect of Afghanistan's sovereignty, independence and integrity, national unity and also non-interference in its internal affairs. He also called for a broad-based, inclusive political structure in that country. Commodore Bhaskar, what does this mean?
I would say that the Defence Minister, Mr. Rajnath Singh, has reiterated a consistent Indian position in relation to developments within Afghanistan. If you recall, even before the US withdrawal, which was August of last year, 2021, and when there was a certain flux in Afghanistan, India had upheld these normative principles about what would be the appropriate political template for Afghanistan to deal with its own internal challenges. But we are aware that due to a variety of reasons, India had a certain constraint in dealing with the post-US withdrawal Afghanistan when the Taliban seized power. And there's a sense of deja vu that India was dealing with a political situation not very different when the Taliban had seized power in Afghanistan in the pre-9/11 context. So I think there is what I would call as a reiteration about what are the elements that India would like to commit itself to or support, knowing fully well that the current political and security situation within Afghanistan and the nature of its own relationship with a country like Pakistan is not conducive to any kind of long-term stability. And this has been compounded by the policies being adopted by the Taliban over the last year. And this is most evident in relation to their gender approach, how they are dealing with the issue of girls and women, which is a replay of some extremely harsh provisions that have been brought into play. So I think as a country that has a stake in the well-being and stability, both of the Afghan people and the socio-political environment in which they are currently located under Taliban rule, India is signaling what I would call as certain principles around which there could be a collective effort. But again, we know from the politics, both within the SCO and the kind of individual priorities for different nation states, particularly the major players, in this case, China, Russia, as two of the more credible members within the SCO, given their own involvement and geography with the region. And Pakistan, which has long played a role, often negative, in relation to the affairs of Afghanistan. Unless there is consensus among them, it is unlikely that there would be any meaningful progress. And I think India's own message at the SCO is to understand the complexity and the different elements that are contributing to the problem, and that unless each of the stakeholders does its own internal review, there would not be any meaningful progress in trying to either stabilize or support Afghanistan at the present juncture.
The defense minister also spoke about not allowing Afghan territory to be used to intimidate or attack any country or providing safe haven to terrorists. Now, he has not named the country, but we all know that he is referring to Pakistan and its activities in Afghanistan. How important is this that we are making a statement, yes, but Pakistan has been doing this in Afghanistan, using that territory to ferment problems all over the world. Mr. Rajnath Singh's statement and the context of today's geopolitical scenario, how do you see it?
You know, this is one of the abiding challenges for the SCO as an organization. Ever since its inception of the SCO, which is also predated by the Shanghai Five, it's more than 20 years now since the SCO was formed. And one of the structural problems was that apart from what I would call as the old chestnuts, the familiar kind of bilateral problems, as for instance between India and Pakistan on one hand, China and India on the other in relation to the territorial dispute. And let us not forget that the SCO also has got four of the Central Asian states, the Stans, and they have their own bilaterals where there is a fair amount of dissonance and discord in relation to both what they perceive as support to terror groups, which have different political and religious drivers within the region. And what they feel is the support being provided to one group or the other by one of the major players. So there are many layers of the security challenge within and among the members of the SCO. And there are many bilaterals that are discordant. But what really I think brings the group together is a concern about the nature of terrorism. Each of these countries has experienced it differently. And let me also say as an analyst that each of these countries has also been culpable in different ways in either aggravating, stoking, or endorsing in a tacit way some of these activities. Some countries, of course, their track record is too stark to be ignored, as in the case of Pakistan, which has invested in terror in terms of state policy. But again, without rocking the boat, I think the SCO has allowed countries to share their own concerns at a fairly senior political level, which is what the Defense Ministers Forum does provide. So I think this is the challenge for the political leadership of the SCO member countries, that to what degree are they willing to make an effort to review existing policies where they are seen to be either deliberately or inadvertently stoking terror, and taking Afghanistan as the case study where the incubation of terror, particularly that with the Islamist orientation, is a reality, is something that would have to be addressed over the long term, because the manifestation can be very unpredictable, as we have seen, for instance, in the case of the so-called lone wolf attack on the well-known writer, Mr. Salman Rushdie. Now, that is the most recent example. We just have to reel back and recall what has been happening within Afghanistan over the last 3 to 4 months, where periodically different groups have claimed responsibility, whether affiliated to the Islamic State or otherwise, for attacks on sectarian targets, again within the larger framework of the Islamic faith. Now, these are very real challenges within the Central Asian region and the proximate Southern Asian region.
Very rightly, you have pointed out that terrorism is one of the things that the SCO has not addressed adequately. The Defence Minister yesterday, Rajnath Singh ji, spoke specifically about stopping all forms of cross-border terrorism. He also spoke about seeking a joint institutional capability with the SCO member states. Now, this is a dichotomy in itself because one of the member states is Pakistan, which actually thrives on exporting terrorism from its country. It's part of its state policy. How serious is the SCO in dealing with the subject?
Yeah, I think the SCO had taken a very careful decision when they admitted, if you remember, both India and Pakistan, knowing fully well that there is a history about Pakistan and its own support to terror-related activities that goes back to the Cold War. If you remember, it is the beginning of this whole investment by the Pakistani deep state in terror is almost coterminous with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and the decade that followed. So I think when the SCO had prioritized counter-terrorism as one of its principal activities, and the need to create capacity, I think the macro political decision was that it would be more desirable to bring Pakistan into the tent. By itself, I think it's almost like stating the obvious when we are aware of the nature of the relationship between China and Pakistan, and given China's own locus in the SCO, I think this would have been a given. But my sense is that when you read the deliberations of the early years, Russia also was persuaded that bringing Pakistan into the SCO would perhaps be more desirable than keeping it out. And we do not always have access to the closed-door deliberations. But my sense is that the professionals would have conveyed to Pakistan all the evidence that they had about such state support to terrorism and the fact that even if they are unable to prevail or prevent Pakistan from pursuing this path, I think the SCO enables the group to make Pakistan aware that its own activities are on the radar and no amount of double speak would change the reality on the ground. And this becomes, again, the most complex structural issue to be dealt with. How do you deal with a state that is invested in terror, which I think is the subtext of what the SCO is all about.
Commodore Bhaskar, you have made very important points regarding terrorism and the role of SCO and how Pakistan was actually brought into SCO, seeing the geopolitical scenario. Mr. Rajnath Singh has spoken at the SCO Defence Ministers meeting yesterday in Uzbekistan about several topics, which includes the Russia-Ukraine war, and India has spoken about having a kind of talks between the two parties so that the crisis is resolved. India has also spoken eloquently about Afghanistan and the need to have a stable Afghanistan and non-interference into the affairs of Afghanistan. Commodore Bhaskar, thank you for speaking to us on this subject.
Thank you.